Deep within the jagged, ice-carved veins of the Norwegian coast, a shadow lay draped across the dark waters of Fjord. This was the Tirpitz, a steel leviathan of 52,000 tons, the largest battleship ever to slide down a European slipway. To the architects of the Third Reich, she was more than a ship. She was a floating statement of Germanic destiny. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, in the high command in Berlin, viewed her as their fleet in being, a strategic masterstroke that required her only to exist to be effective. By her mere presence, she forced the British Royal Navy to keep a massive portion of its strength tied down in the North Sea, guarding against a breakout that might never come. The German arrogance was a thick, suffocating fog. They looked at the geography of Norway, the sheer cliffs, the narrow, winding entrances to the fjords, and the unpredictable Arctic weather, and they saw a fortress provided by nature itself. They believed the Tirpitz was nestled in an unassailable moat. In the officers' mess, champagne flowed as they toasted to the impotence of the British. They mocked the Royal Navy as a collection of aging relics and obsolete wood, led by men too timid to enter the lion's den. This belief that the enemy was fundamentally weaker and less daring was the cornerstone of their strategy. They failed to realize that when you corner a lion, it doesn't stay outside the den, it finds a way to tear the den down. By 1944, the Tirpitz was surrounded by what the Germans considered the most sophisticated defensive web ever devised for a single vessel. It was a masterpiece of electronic and chemical warfare. Advanced radar arrays scanned the gray skies, and a vast network of chemical smoke generators stood ready to turn the entire fjord into an opaque white void within minutes. The German commanders were intoxicated by this technical shield. They operated under the delusion that their radar made surprise impossible, and their smoke made targeting futile. This technical overconfidence bred a lethal complacency among the crew and the staff officers in Oslo. They treated their deployment not as a combat mission, but as a scenic retreat in a northern paradise. They spend hours perfecting the aesthetics of their camouflage netting while ignoring the fundamental truth: technology is not a substitute for vigilance. They viewed the British as technologically primitive, a nation of shopkeepers who could never hope to solve the riddle of the fjord. They didn't consider that a smokescreen also blinds the defender, and that a radar is only a tool, not a shield. The blind sentinel was already losing its vision, not to an enemy, but to the suffocating belief that German science had reached a peak the rest of the world could never climb. As the war dragged on, the British Royal Navy, recognizing they could never win a traditional surface engagement inside the narrow fjords, turned to the unconventional, the small, and the desperate. They developed X-craft midget submarines and Chariot human torpedoes, tiny, cramped vessels that seemed like toys compared to the towering turrets of the Tirpitz. When German naval intelligence received reports of these developments, the reaction was one of pure, unadulterated mockery. The elite German naval aristocracy, men who measured power in the caliber of guns and the thickness of belt armor, could not conceive that their 50,000-ton masterpiece could be threatened by mechanical insects. They viewed these British efforts as the pathetic final gasps of a dying empire that had run out of real weapons. This contempt for the weak and the unconventional was a strategic cancer. They refused to upgrade their underwater listening devices or install more complex torpedo netting, believing that no sane sailor would attempt to navigate the treacherous, mine-strewn waters of the fjord in a submarine no larger than a city bus. They were looking for a grand fleet engagement on the horizon, a glorious battle they were prepared for, while the real executioners were already swimming silently inches beneath their hull, ignored because they were deemed too small to matter. The morning of September 22, 1943, delivered a shock that should have ended German arrogance forever. British X-craft midget submarines had done the impossible. They had infiltrated the fjord, bypassed the perfect patrol lines, and placed 4-ton explosive charges directly under the Tirpitz's keel. The massive explosions that followed did not sink the ship, but they lifted the 50,000-ton beast several feet out of the water, shattering her internal machinery, jamming her main batteries, and bending her propeller shafts. The Titan was crippled without a single shot being fired from her massive guns. Yet even in the face of this catastrophic failure, the high command in Berlin refused to learn. Instead of acknowledging the vulnerability of their position, they pivoted to propaganda. They celebrated the heroic repair efforts, bragging that German labor and engineering could mend in months what the British terrorists had tried to destroy. They repaired the steel, but they left the pride intact. They decided to keep the Tirpitz in Norway, convinced that lightning wouldn't strike twice and that the British had surely exhausted their bag of tricks. They mistook a temporary survival for a permanent victory, failing to see that the British hadn't just damaged a ship, they had proven that the fjord was no longer a sanctuary. In late 1944, as the Soviet juggernaut pushed from the east, the Tirpitz was moved south to an anchorage near Tromsø. The German planners argued with characteristic ego that this move was a strategic masterstroke. They envisioned the ship as a floating fortress and a massive coastal battery that would annihilate any Allied attempt at an amphibious landing in northern Norway. However, this move was a death sentence disguised as a promotion. By moving to Tromsø, the Tirpitz was now within the range of the RAF's heavy bombers based in Scotland. More importantly, the new anchorage was shallow and lacked the protective steep walls of the fjord. The German generals dismissed these concerns. They were convinced that their anti-aircraft fire, a wall of over 100 guns, would create a death zone through which no heavy bomber could fly with accuracy. They also relied on the presence of the Luftwaffe's fighter wing at nearby Bardufoss. They believed the British were too cautious to send slow, lumbering Lancasters against the finest air defenses in the Reich. They were preparing for a defensive battle on their own terms, never imagining that the British had developed a weapon that didn't need a direct hit on the deck to turn a ship into a grave. The single most damning evidence of German arrogance was the total collapse of inter-service cooperation on the day of the final attack. The German Navy and the Luftwaffe existed in a state of perpetual, ego-driven rivalry. The naval commanders in Tromsø viewed the Air Force as a secondary support service, while the Luftwaffe leaders at Bardufoss were reluctant to risk their dwindling fighter strength for naval protection without explicit high-level orders. On November 12, 1944, when the British Lancasters were detected, the communication between the ship and the airfield became a tragic comedy of errors. Rigid bureaucratic protocols and a siloed command structure meant that the alarm was delayed and the fighter pilots were held on the ground, waiting for proper authorization. The generals in Berlin had built a war machine that was technologically brilliant, but socially and organizationally broken. While the sailors on the Tirpitz scanned the skies for the invincible Focke-Wulfs that would never come, the British were already lining up their bomb sites. The Sentinel was not just blind, it was abandoned by its own brothers, a victim of a military culture that valued individual prestige and rank over collective survival. At precisely 9:41 a.m., the sky over Tromsø was torn apart by the roar of 32 Lancaster bombers. They were the elite 617 Dambusters Squadron, and they carried the most terrifying weapon in the Allied arsenal, the Tall Boy. These were 12,000-pound earthquake bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis to penetrate deep into the earth before exploding. The German gunners on the Tirpitz opened fire with everything they had, their internal arrogance still whispering that no plane could hit a moving target, or even a stationary one from 14,000 feet. But the Tall Boys were different. They were aerodynamically perfect, spinning as they fell to maintain a terrifyingly straight trajectory. One bomb struck the turret Kaiser, tearing through the armored deck as if it were parchment. Another hit the port side, near the engine room. But even the near misses were lethal. They buried themselves in the soft seabed next to the hull and detonated with the force of a small earthquake. The shock waves crushed the Tirpitz's impenetrable hull from the outside in. In seconds, the engineering marvel of the Third Reich was being dismantled by the cold, hard laws of physics that her designers thought they had surpassed. As the Tirpitz began to list violently to port, the true cost of German overconfidence became apparent. For years, the crew had been drilled with the belief that the ship was unsinkable, that her 300 watertight compartments and perfect buoyancy control would save her from any damage. Because of this indoctrination, when the order to abandon ship was finally given, it was too late. Many men, trusting in the invincibility of the steel around them, remained at their posts or in the lower decks, waiting for the ship to stabilize. They didn't know that during previous repairs, certain structural changes had been made that shifted the ship's center of gravity, changes the high-level planners had dismissed as statistically insignificant. Within minutes, the 52,000-ton battleship didn't just sink, she reached a point of no return and rolled completely upside down. Her massive superstructures crashed into the mud of the fjord, sealing the exits. Nearly 1,000 men were suddenly trapped in a lightless, airless, inverted steel world. The floating fortress had become a massive iron tomb, a result of a command that planned for every victory, but never for a catastrophic loss. The scene after the capsizing was a nightmare that stripped away the last vestiges of German military pride. Rescuers scrambled onto the slimy, barnacle-encrusted bottom of the ship, now the only part visible above the freezing water. Below their feet, they could hear the frantic, rhythmic tapping of hundreds of sailors, using wrenches and pipes to signal for help from within the air pockets of the hull. The master race of engineers and planners now stood helpless. They had spent millions of Reichsmarks on cannons and fire control systems, but they had provided almost no heavy-duty cutting equipment or rescue protocols for a capsize. They had to fly in specialized blowtorches and divers, but the process of cutting through the thick, Krupp steel was agonizingly slow. As the torches bit into the hull, they often consumed the very oxygen the men inside needed to survive, or caused the air pockets to fail, drowning the sailors in the dark. This was the ultimate realization of hubris. The men who believed they were untouchable were now literally suffocating inside their own masterpiece, betrayed by leaders who thought they were too superior to fail. In the days following the sinking, the German High Command did not reflect on their strategic errors. They looked for someone to execute. The Navy and the Luftwaffe engaged in a vitriolic exchange of blame that reached the highest levels of the Reich. Hitler, fueled by his usual cocktail of drugs and delusions, was convinced that the queen of his navy could only have been lost through treason or cowardice. They found their scapegoat in Major Heinrich Erler, the highly decorated commander of the fighter wing at Bardufoss. He was court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and sentenced to death, later commuted to a front-line suicide mission, despite the fact that the failure was rooted in the broken communication systems and the arrogant, decentralized command structure that Hitler himself had created. The arrogance of the leadership prevented them from admitting that the era of the battleship was over and that their perfect defenses were a sieve. By punishing a hero, they thought they could hide their own incompetence. The culture of the Third Reich had become a snake eating its own tail, more concerned with preserving the myth of invincibility than the reality of survival. After the guns fell silent in 1945, the upturned hull of the Tirpitz remained in the waters near Tromsø, a grotesque, rusting landmark that locals called the Island of Iron. For nearly a decade, a Norwegian salvage company, Hovding Shipshugging, worked to cut the behemoth apart. The invincible Krupp steel, which the German generals believed would protect their 1,000-year Reich, was sold off by the ton. It was melted down and repurposed to build Norwegian bridges, razor blades, and even domestic appliances like frying pans. The ship that was meant to be a monument to a global empire ended its existence as scrap metal for the very people it was built to intimidate and conquer. This was the final, humble indignity of the Blind Sentinel. It serves as a stark historical lesson on the impermanence of power built on pride. The steel was strong, but it was not stronger than the time and the shifting tide of history. What was once the most feared object in the North Sea was literally consumed by the world it tried to destroy. In the final analysis, the Tirpitz was a masterpiece of 1930s engineering that was utterly defeated by 1940s innovation. The German High Command's fundamental error, their greatest arrogance, was the belief that they could control the seas with a lone wolf strategy. They believed that one supership was worth more than a fleet of balanced carriers and destroyers. They looked at the Tirpitz and saw a god of the sea. The British looked at her and saw a mathematical and engineering problem to be solved with persistence, creativity, in the weak tools of unconventional warfare. The Royal Navy and the RAF proved that no amount of armor is thick enough to withstand a determined enemy who is willing to innovate. The German generals never understood that their enemy didn't need to be stronger in a fair fight. They just needed to be smarter in an unfair one. The Tirpitz didn't fail because her crew was weak or her guns were small. She failed because the men who ordered her into the fjord were blinded by the reflection of their own perceived glory. Today, the fjord and the Tromsø coastline are silent. The water is still as glass. But beneath the surface, the scars of the Tallboy craters remain. These massive depressions in the seabed are the true final signature of the Third Reich's naval ambition. They are holes in the world where pride met reality. The lesson of the Blind Sentinel is a haunting warning for any leader today. Arrogance is not a defense, it is a blindfold. It is a smokescreen that eventually suffocates the one who ignites it. The German generals thought they were hidden in the fjords, but they were actually trapped in a geography they didn't respect. They thought they were invulnerable, but they were merely stationary targets in a changing world. As the Arctic wind howls across the water, it carries the echo of a lesson the Reich never learned, that the tallest wall and the thickest armor are useless if the eyes behind them refuse to see the truth until it's falling from the sky at the speed of sound.